So I'll ask Sheila and Dennis to come up to the front. And Dennis, you'll introduce Sheila.
I met Sheila Darnowski a few years ago after King Aurora Hospice moved from King City to just on the south edge of Aurora, very close to where Eleanor and I live. It was then that my handyman techniques and skills came into play. Sheila had bought one of these big, large cabinets that they needed for storage of various materials at their new office. So I was hired to come and put it all together. Well, she helped me with the screwdriver and holding pieces, and it finally got put together, and I got my reward, a cup of tea and a nice cookie. My wife has rubbed elbows with Sheila for quite a few years now, as she is also a volunteer at King Aurora Hospice. Sheila was a nurse by profession, graduated from the University of Toronto back in 1983. She's worked in hospital and in the community as a professional nurse, and she's really gained a lot of personal empathy, starting with when she cared for an aunt while she was ill with pancreatic cancer. And so she learned firsthand the need for the support of people when they're in the final stages of life. In 1991, Sheila moved to York Region, where she began a long and dedicated part of her life volunteering with what was Hospice King and is now Hospice King Aurora, or HKA as it's sometimes called. As a stay-at-home mom for 17 years, she also managed to be a hospice in-home visitor, and then an HKA board member, and in fact, she has volunteered for Hospice King Aurora for over 20 years. More recently, Sheila became a full-time employee working as executive director of HKA. Then in June of this year, she retired, and from that position has taken again on the job of a volunteer. And just recently, when her replacement decided to go on holidays, she's taken over the executive director's position again. Today she'll be telling you about the varied services provided by hospice, and can be found in many areas throughout the province. There are brochures at the back on the hospice covering this area, and if anybody's interested, she'll be staying after for our lunch, and please feel free to talk with her and get all the real lowdown on how to become a hospice visitor. Sheila?
Thank you, Dennis. So I don't need my glasses to read, but I need them to see you, so every now and then I have to put them on. As Dennis said, I'm going to talk today about community hospice, and the image that people sometimes have of hospice when you say, oh, I volunteer for a hospice, they always say, oh. And the word hospice actually came from the Latin word hospitum, which means a guest house. And it is a shelter for weary travelers when they were doing the religious pilgrimages through Europe. So the modern hospice movement, however, began in the 1960s just outside of London, England, where Dr. Cicely Saunders founded St. Christopher's Hospice, which was a place for the weary and the ill to go, and were able to die there comfortably. Okay, the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about today is hospice and palliative care. I'm going to talk a bit about the difference between residential and community hospices, and about the clients, the volunteers, the services, and some of the work that the national and provincial organizations do, and about community hospices in your area. So the next slide, please. So what is hospice palliative care? The Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association defines hospice palliative care as being aimed at relief of suffering and improving the quality of life of persons who are living or dying from advanced disease, and also people who are bereaved. So the important part, I think, to take from this definition, that hospice is for the living, because it is able to improve their quality of life and improve their quality of life with the rest of their family and loved ones. The difference between hospice and palliative care, there really is none. It's just that in Canada both terms are used. The word hospice is often used in the community, and the words palliative care are often in hospitals where there's palliative care units. They're very similar to hospices, but they don't have that home-like. They provide the same services, but they don't have the home-like feeling that a hospice does. And in Ontario, and across Canada, there are two types of hospices. The residential ones with the beds, as you had the quote from Hill House Hospice. That's a residential hospice in Richmond Hill that has 3 beds. And it actually, sadly, is the only residential hospice currently in York Region with 3 beds. And I don't think there's any residential hospice in the Scarborough area that people need to go to Dorothy Lay downtown if they're interested in that. But provincially there's money in the works to build, the provincial and the federal plan recognizes the importance of it, and they're starting to build some more. So the community hospices are ones without beds, and that's like Hospice King Aurora and the Hub in Scarborough and Durham Hospice here nearby. We are a group of individuals who go into people's homes and help them stay in their homes. Because of 75 or 80% of people who ask where they would like to die, they say they'd like to die in their homes. And we try to help fulfill that. Okay, the next slide. Thank you. So this is the different. Residential hospices have beds, and they just have admission during the final stages. Each residential hospice has a different criteria, but maybe 30 days, maybe 2 weeks before death, or before presumed or prognosticated death. So it offers 24-hour nursing and personal support care for the family and everyone in that family and circle. And there's no charge for any of those services. The community hospital, there are no beds. So we have an office. They usually have a little some sort of office area, and their clients are admitted from the time of diagnosis. So if I were diagnosed with any type of life-threatening illness, I would be able to go and get help right then. We offer many different programs, which I'll talk about, that people can do from the time of diagnosis until death. There's one-on-one group support, and we also provide services in the client's home, or that they can come to our office or, wherever the group's being held. Hospice King Aurora was one of the first hospices in Ontario, community hospices. It was started in the 1980s, and it received its charitable status in 1983. And it was started by an Anglican minister in King City who knew one of his parishioners had a mother who was dying and she wanted to look after her. And he also knew another parishioner of his was very interested in the hospice movement and had talked to him about that. So he united these two women, and with the third, they went on and established Hospice King. And it has helped all the neighboring hospices set up in Richmond Hill, Vaughan, Newmarket, and helped grow the residential movement. So next slide, please. Thank you. So our clients are individuals of all ages who've been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. They may have cancer. We have some with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. I've looked after people with cancer, with Lou Gehrig's, with lung disease, with advanced Alzheimer's. And that's what we started with just the visiting, people who were ill. And then as the needs of the community changed and the community said, this is, we responded to the community wants, we've developed 3 types of clients. So these are the visiting type clients, someone with some illness. And then the next slide shows we've expanded to family caregivers. So people who are looking after their loved one, people who are having trouble and struggling with the process of the disease, and people need help finding services that can help them deal with looking after their loved one and keeping them at home. Then our third category of clients are bereaved people who have lost someone through death, and we have many support groups and that sort of thing. So most hospices in Ontario do have the complete package with serving all 3 types of clients. So the next slide shows hospice volunteers. And as Dennis said, I got involved because I had a great aunt who I lived with on and off during nursing school because she lived near Sunnybrook. So, and 3 great nieces looked after her, and we kept her home till fairly near the end, and she was admitted to hospital right near the end. But it's a lot of our people who come to us are volunteers who have had some sort of event like that in their life, who've looked after a loved one and has seen the need for community hospice. So when we get volunteers coming, they're enrolled in a 30-hour training course which talks about palliative care, and there's different sessions on pain control, spiritual, helping family members, bereavement, different things, a 10-week course. And then we have some more training within the hospice for them as well. All volunteers are screened and oriented, and usually we ask them to offer about 2 to 4 hours a week of care to individuals. The next slide shows the roles. So if you're thinking, I could never do that, because some people say, I could never sit with people who are dying, I'd have a hard time with that, and a lot of people do. So there is a role for everyone. We have administrative and volunteer office people, which do a lot of different help with events, help send out letters to our donors. Right now, I am doing, in my volunteer capacity, sending out things for the annual general meeting, making sure all the letters are right, stuffing envelopes, that sort of thing. We also have fundraising volunteers, and we have a board of directors who are all volunteers as well. So each hospice, I presume, has all these roles, and if you're not interested in the client side and don't feel comfortable with that, you can help with another. So the next slide, the volunteers are the backbone of the hospices, but they each have professional staff who provide, when a client is referred, what's Heidi's name? What's she called? I can't remember right now. Isn't that awful? She was my employee. Anyway, she's I forget. Anyway, she goes out and assesses the clients. I used to do that sometimes too as well. But so she goes into the community, she visits the client at their home, and would see what they need to help them stay at home. So when I would finish my assessment, at the very back page would say, the volunteer needs to be able to help this lady up to the bathroom. She's maybe just a little unsteady. They need to be able to just provide a little light lunch, talk to her about X, Y, Z. I would also investigate their hobbies, because you like to know them so that you can match your volunteers with them. So that's another thing that the staff do, is they screen the volunteers and select the volunteers, and then they match them with the clients. So one of my favorite clients that I had, I was matched with because the coordinator at the time said to me, "Sheila, doesn't your son play rugby?" And I said, yeah. She said, and you like sports, you got to go and see this guy. So he had played rugby during his he was English and had played during his adult life as well. And the two of us basically just watched sports on TV. His wife didn't want to leave him alone alone, and he really didn't need someone with him, but she didn't want to leave in case he needed anything. So the two of us just watched sports, and I'm a huge soccer fan, and so we watched soccer, we watched rugby. He taught me all the fine points of rugby, and one time when I was away, someone else went, and his wife told me, Trevor said the lady was very nice, but she just didn't know her sports like Sheila. So that's another element that we do, is we try to match volunteers with a client so that they know their interest. One time I found out a gentleman I assessed was interested in mushrooms. He was Italian, and he'd always gone in the woods and gathered mushrooms and this sort of thing. And actually a client who was a bit interested in nature we put with him, and the two of them were just unbelievable. Most of their talks were all about mushrooms. So, the most obscure thing can bond people and make them part of their life. So the next slide, first, sorry, you don't have to switch back. The other thing that our professional staff do is they liaise with the multidisciplinary team. At South Lake Hospital, which is in our area, there's a meeting every 2 weeks with the doctor, the hospice palliative care team nurses, the nurses from the CCAC, the Community Care Access Center, the agencies that go into homes, and they talk about the clients if there's any problems, so that we are part of that multidisciplinary team. So we're able to carry out, and we know what's going on, and it just helps. We can also say, you know what, I think this person needs a little more care, and they'll look into it and that sort of thing. So we're always in contact with the healthcare team as well. So the services that we provide, first for visiting volunteers, are the non-medical home support, in-home support, that psychosocial support and the practical assistance. So if someone would be going out, our volunteers would come into the home, sit with the person, do things with them, watch TV. Sometimes I help people do a little craft. We looked at photo albums, different things like this, talk with them. Sometimes they rest. Sometimes you'll get someone who doesn't want to interact with you, but the caregiver needs a rest, that they would just sleep the whole time and I would read a book, but you're still assisting the family member to get out. So the next slide. So the bond that the volunteer makes with the family during this is immeasurable. And when people say to me, oh, I don't know how you do that, that must be so awful, or very, very hard, I always say, like someone said in your quote, that you get back so much more. Because when someone's diagnosed with cancer or is dying, people tend to withdraw just a little. They don't really want to bother them, or they don't know what to say, and people don't mean to withdraw, but they do. And so the fact that you're out there and you're reaching out and you are bonding with this family, and you're actually able to help them and ease their journey by letting them get out to go shopping or do something like that, is really rewarding. And honestly, it's very sad when someone dies, but the joy that you get from making contact with the families and being with them is more than anything that I've ever experienced. It's really, really great, the bond that you make with the families. So as I said, we give caregiver support and relief, and the next slide will show that we also do legacy work. We've just started doing this. A new board member was interested in this. He's a Chinese Canadian, and he had all his memories that he has of his grandmother are through slides and that sort of thing, and he started being interested in what he called legacy work. So we've started, and Eleanor actually is doing this with her client. So we did with the board member, Jason, Heidi and I just made a little mock-up. So this would be, you might do this, I'll pass this around for everybody. This is just a little small one. You can make it bigger, but he took pictures. He said, let's say, assemble 10 things that are important to Hospice King, or 20 or something. And then we had 1 or 2 little minutes that we talked about each item and the evolution of the history of Hospice King. So it's kind of like the life of a person, the life of Hospice King. So this is what you can do, what we're starting to do with our clients, and what you could do with any of your friends or whatever is go through and show them that. So it's a tool available to our visiting volunteers that we're starting, because one of the things that we do as visiting volunteers is to validate the life of the client and tell them what a good job they have done with their family members, make their life's work, their work life, that it mattered, and that they have mattered, and that their life was meaningful. So the next slide. We also offer yoga and meditation, and these are 2 of our most popular programs. We have yoga on an evening another night for people who are working, because often people diagnosed with cancer still, as you know, work through their chemotherapy or whatever, and are back working, although they still have chemotherapy regimes, and they come during the evening. So we have the next slide. There's a large empty space where we are in an industrial warehouse now. It used to be a TV studio. So this was one of the TV studios. It's about 30 feet long and I think about 18 feet wide. So we have 2 of those rooms, and we left one of them completely empty so that we can have yoga in there. And we also have put up tables and have dinners in there. We've had speakers. There's other charities in the building. They've used the space for their board meetings that have 18 people, different things like that. So it's a very useful space, but here's a picture of the yoga. And it's a very gentle yoga. Some people do it in chairs. It's just at their level. So the next slide, art and music therapy. We also have those from time to time. They're usually, we don't have a concurrently running one currently. We have special occasions. Like last fall there was a colorful walk. So they went through a walk through a conservation area nearby and then came back and drew art, made some art through their inspiration from that walk. So this, the next slide is an example, not from this fall, but from another time. And in the book, when you're passing it around, there's a picture of a framed print that's quite colorful, you'll see as well, and that came from an art therapy session. And then the next slide after this is one of our most treasured slides, pictures. This came last year from our children's group, and it was just drawn spontaneously in the evening, or at the end of the program, when it was about a half an hour before when the program was over and her mother would come and pick her up. And this is a 7-year-old girl drew this picture. And my favorite part of the picture is the pleated skirt and the little high heels. I remember drawing high heels like that when I was about 7. and the pink headband. You know, there's the tears and the other things, but I love. She had a pink headband on that day, so it was a lovely photo, lovely picture. The next slide, we also are almost as popular as yoga, are complementary therapies. So we have licensed practitioners who provide their time free of charge to do Reiki, reflexology, and healing touch, therapeutic touch, that sort of things with our client. And you can go to the next slide. And we've got a special therapy room set aside, and there's a picture of that as well in the booklet. And finally, the next slide, we give grief and bereavement support. And we have drop-in groups and they're run by volunteers and they're co-facilitated by volunteers with peer support. And we also have educational groups for women who have lost a spouse currently, and we have an 8-week educational children's group as well. So there's general loss needs as crisis, or we have other groups as things arise. We had a suicide group a few years ago, and also we had a loss of a child group as well. So we also have children's groups, and the next two slides show, this is a picture, I can't see it very well, but I hope you can, it's not too dark. This is at our old office. We had a lovely big backyard, and this is the children's group. The last week of the session, they have a balloon release. So we had lots of kids. We divide them into several age groups with the volunteers, and Andrew Welch, the gentleman from the reading, or the young man, he helped with this group. And then the next slide, and then they would release the balloons in memory of their loved one, sometimes with a message inside the balloon. And that was always a very, very popular thing. And Andrew is still helping. The next slide, we have a children's summer day camp. And Andrew still helps. He's a teacher now, and with the Toronto board, I believe, or York region. But he still comes in the summer and leads our children's groups, and he's a great guy. So the next slide shows they went on a treetop climbing things. So the camp is just doing ordinary, everyday activities that kids like to do. They go to Canada's Wonderland one day, and they do things like that. But the kids are together in a group with children who have experienced a similar loss. So every child in this group has lost either a sibling or a parent. And in that way, they're able to speak freely to one another about this without any sort of stigmatization or teasing or anything like that. And last year, I haven't been involved as much with the kids group, but last year they needed a driver to help them take them to the Courtright Conservation Area where they went for some activities. And it was very interesting that day in the car to hear the kids ask one another about, it was the first day actually, and to hear the kids ask one another what happened to each other's parents. And one girl turned to another in the front and said, "What did your dad do before he died?" And then the girl would just tell her, and, "Oh, my dad did such and such." And when we were in the circle, before we started out, we had to go around the circle, and each had to tell who had died and what their favorite sport. So when it came to me, I told them that one of my best friends had died. And the girl in the car, the young girl, she was 8, she remembered Roland's name, and she said, "So Sheila, what happened to Roland?" From that little group, she'd remembered his name and asked me about it. And I thought it was really lovely, and the way the kids would interact all the time. And they would ask each other difficult questions about, was your dad sick before he died? But the comfort that they had in asking each other all these questions and talking about it was really, it really struck me as well, because I hadn't been involved much with that. Okay, so the next slide, we also, hope I'm not going over, sorry. The next slide is, we just speak in the community as I am now. We represent Hospice King at other regional and municipal events and that sort of thing. And the following slide, Hospice Palliative Care Ontario and the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association are two national bodies. So their purpose is to, Hospice Palliative Care Ontario strives for a future where every person in Ontario has access to quality hospice palliative care. And it's to be the unified voice of collaborative quality hospice care, and they provide leadership. And the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association is the national voice. It advocates for quality end-of-life and hospice care, and it includes work on public policy, education, and awareness. And you might have seen, the next slide, a lot of things about the Speak Up campaign, and that is encouraging people to have plans for end of life. And I've got some information at the back about it, as well as some bookmarks that have got a myth on it. So one of them is that, one of the pieces of literature says 100% of Canadians are going to die. Do you have a plan? So different things like that. So there's some bookmarks at the back, some information about the Speak Up. I would encourage you can just Google Speak Up and look for the Ontario version. And I sat down last time I was home with my parents. My dad's 83 and my mother turned 80, and she has a vascular dementia. And She can still do the Sudoku and the crossword, but she can't remember what she said 5 minutes ago. So I went through the little booklet with them, and so that was good, got kind of their opinions on everything, and they were fairly consistent. The next morning, my mother had no knowledge that we'd done the booklet, but I sat down with her and just went through a few things, and she gave the same answers totally again. And as I say to people, my mother's still competent, but she just can't remember that she is. But she's still competent, and all her answers are consistent. And so I am their power of attorney for personal care. So now I am aware of their wishes and know exactly what they want if any of the scenarios happen. So it's a very important thing to do. So finally, I've put up the address for the Scarborough Centre for Healthy Communities, the Hub it's called, in Mid-Scarborough, and there's the address, and there's information at the back on this. The Scarborough Centre for Healthy Communities has 38 programs running throughout 10 sites. So not all of them are hospice, there are other community things as well. And hospice palliative care is at that Eglinton, the office is at that Eglinton address, because there's 10 different sites. And they have the same as Hospice King, the hospice, the visiting program in people's homes, they have the caregiver program, and they also have bereavement programs. They have one-to-one, they have visiting, they have groups, they have complementary therapies as well. The other hospice nearby, Hospice Durham, they have day programs where people can go and meet with other people who have cancer or other diagnoses, and their caregivers can meet. So there are these programs, just like the one I've described to you that we belong to in King Aurora, in your community. And if you are interested, there are also application forms for Scarborough Hospice at the back, or you can contact any of the hospices and they'd be pleased to hear from you. And I hope I haven't been too long. I get excited about this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I was thinking when you were saying 100% of Canadians are going to die, it reminded me of, they say it's only two things that we can count on in life, death and taxes. I think you can get out of taxes. One of the things that really struck me is, the work you do. I mean, you're really agents of compassion and mercy. But a lot of the work you do is you take the stigma out of death and dying and bereavement, and that brings a freedom. And I think your message to pre-plan and to get out there, get ahead of it, that'll bring comfort to each of us and our families. So I think she's giving us really great advice. So we're at the end of our service, and let's remember, the great messages from Sheila, and take that with us. And remember, we are the light, so let's get out there and shine.